Let me welcome our next three panelists. We have Adrian Heieis of Tech Resources, Tamara Crockett of Hexagon, and Rob Daw, who you heard earlier, is Chief Innovation Officer for Hexagon Mining Division. Welcome. Good to see you again. So what is ESG on a practical level? And what is it that companies who do it well do so that it is more than PR?
Well, make sure this works first.
Adrian.
Yeah, thank you. Pleasure to be here. Thanks, everybody. I think a lot of different terms are used interchangeably by people, ESG, sustainability, and the last thing you said there about how do we avoid it just being PR is something I think about often. I think a lot of the time it comes down to marketing, and ESG is about investing in who can do the best job of marketing their ESG plays, who has the prettiest, longest sustainability strategy. So I think it does come down to the action and the impact, and looking holistically at ESG as well. It's very easy to focus solely on one pillar, like decarbonization, which is entirely fair because that's probably the biggest issue that we are facing in mining. But there's a lot of other aspects to ESG, and I think it's important that you look at all of them holistically.
Either of the two of you want to comment on that?
Yeah, it's a really broad topic, and I agree with Adrian. It's a lot about marketing. People view it as a marketing opportunity, putting a lot of resources into it from that angle. But from a regulatory perspective, from a government intervention or government leadership perspective, we're starting to see some real teeth coming out of it. And it's really befuddling a number of companies in terms of how do you take it from a marketing activity to a real activity that you implement in your operations.
I think we've seen probably over the last 2 to 3 years especially, there has been a big transition from marketing. At least there was strategies put in place, and now we're seeing execution. So there are, a number of different companies that have done things in the environmental space through decarbonisation. There's people who are coming out with their targets, not just in the environmental side of things, but also in the diversity within their workforce and some of the mandates that they're wanting to in their businesses. And I think that's what's really helping drive some of this change as well.
So how are ESG factors affecting investment in mining?
Yeah,
Rob, take that, please.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge one. I think you see the social investor now. So we've become a lot more sophisticated in our access to information and knowledge, and the people are walking with their feet out the door if a company doesn't actually have a strong ESG policy. They're just not getting the access to that capital through the super funds or through any of these large investment groups. So it's definitely been something in the last probably 18 months that we've really seen more prevalent, that access through the stock exchange and things like that. It's just not there if you don't have that plan.
Tamara, how is ESG impacting permitting?
It's impacting permitting from the perspective of it's becoming a driver in permitting. It's becoming an important concept in permitting, especially the social aspects of permitting and the governance that goes with that. NGOs are more involved, communities are more involved. The hope is that it's not extending permitting. We already have a problem in many places with permitting taking so long, but I think it's a little early to determine or to really comment too much on what ESG is doing with permitting in the long run.
So Adrian, how is it impacting recruitment of talent?
Yeah, as we heard in the previous panel, talent acquisition, retention is one of the biggest challenges that we face. I've seen it a lot within my own company, and two examples that I can think of, one a little bit more negative, one a little bit more positive, is that I think I had a class of about 20 engineers when I graduated, and last time I counted, maybe half of them are still in mining. Right, so half of these mining engineers from about 10 years ago, half of them have gone off to software or some other industry. And that at the same time, we're seeing hundreds of vacancies across our organization. And so it often comes down to how do we get people, how do we share people across the industry? Fortunately, what I have seen is that working in the sustainability space, I've had dozens, hundreds of people, even within my organization, outside of my organization, say, how can I come work with you? I don't even care what the job is. I don't care what I'm going to do. I want to work in health and safety or sustainability. And so there's a massive draw of talent because of those values that we've been speaking to.
So how can the mining company translate this to younger people when they're looking for careers coming out of secondary schools? Is there a role for the mining industry to translate this in a way that young people see mining as a place where they want to go because they know they can make a difference?
100%. I think it's on all of us to really promote the mining industry, the value that we generate, I guess, but also what is the attractiveness of mining. And I think it's there's a few campaigns that I've seen from different universities, different other schools around to really try and attract people into that mining world. And I think it's something that we've got to continue to build on and make sure that we do attract some of the best talent as well. Not just talent, but the best talent into mining so that we can continue to innovate in that space.
Do you see any differences among small, medium, and large companies? There certainly must be challenges with small companies, smaller budgets, big companies, big budgets. So Adrian, maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, maybe just a brief comment. Tech is a fairly large company, so we have the benefit of having a lot of resources combined with our values to address ESG and sustainability topics. But with all of the regulations, all of the challenges, all of them highly complex, it is difficult. It can be highly demanding, and you risk running into a situation where all you're doing is responding and filling out regulation and responding to regulation and not actually having the time to think about strategy and implementation. And so it comes down to almost, again, people and having the resources to actually address these issues.
Yeah, it's really resource intensive, having an active ESG program. From my side on the support services function in legal and policy, there's a lot of information and a lot of data and a lot of things to keep up with, especially for those entities that are working multinationals and across borders. And so we're seeing some struggles with some of the younger, smaller companies, and I think that's going to continue to be a challenge for them, very much so like it's still a challenge, those same issues for larger companies.
So when we think about operating across country borders and jurisdictions, can you give us even anecdotally what you think have been some successful strategies, Tamara?
I don't know if it's a successful strategy. It's a strategy that I'm seeing a lot of, and it happens to be in the supply chain area, where we're seeing our customers, the large mining companies, come in and ask for more information about our ESG initiatives. What are we doing? How are we doing it? Document. They're trying to validate their supply chains. At the same time, we're turning around and having to do the same with our supply chain. So I think from an anecdotal perspective, that's one of the big issues that's really popped up the last few years.
Rob, care to comment on that? Sort of thoughts on best in class globally?
As one with Tamara, I don't think it's necessarily having best in class. It's just being agile enough to adapt and adopt to the different regions in the world. So unfortunately, everyone's got different legislation, everyone's got different rules that they want to follow and adhere by through the regulators. And so it's almost like, I guess, an 80-20 type rule where you want to have your frameworks, you want to have your key initiatives, but you've always got to be flexible enough then to adapt to those local areas.
So how can technology help ESG? How can data acquisition help ESG?
Data acquisition drives a lot of ESG, a lot of activities. ESG is very broad, and so there are a lot of activities that go into that, a lot of different types of data. So it's not just about collecting data, but deciphering that data. How do you put that data to work? And I think from a policy and legal perspective, that's not always easy. We don't always have the tools and technologies at this point to help us do that. It's very manual, very, very intensive individual personal time, tracking new legislation and developing new policies and reviewing contracts that are cross-border in nature.
Yeah, I think, and then more on the environmental side. So our ability to be able to go through and create a digital twin of what we had prior to mining, And then it gives us a good goal of what we want to be able to achieve when we rehab that mine and bring it back to what it was previously. So our ability's there, and then ongoing tracking as well after it. So how is our rehab program progressing, and where we're at, and these sorts of programs, making sure that we are on target for that.
So I get a lot of students ask me about the responsibility of mining companies for the local communities in which they are engaged in the extractive industry. And I think that mining companies do play an important role in making sure that they're held accountable to those local communities. And certainly ESG has brought that to the forefront now, and everyone thinks about that. But Adrian, if you think about Teck and other companies you're familiar with in terms of your stakeholder community building efforts, can you give us a sense of what you think is working and where innovation is needed?
Yeah, absolutely. Something that I really appreciate about Teck as a company is it treats its relationships with its communities very seriously, and really does treat it as a partnership. It was one of my first ever jobs in mining years ago, was a co-op with Teck in Fernie. I didn't know Teck was a company, I just wanted to go skiing. And you learn about it very quickly because they're so pervasive and actively engaging with the community. And I think if you go back a number of years, it was a nice to have, and it helps becoming a part of your community. But I think more and more so today, it's no longer a choice when we come back to talking about permitting. Right? If you're not engaging with the local communities and First Nations, you won't get your permit to either develop a new mine or to extend your mine life. And so it really isn't a choice, and the only way to get the support of those communities is to treat it as a partnership, to work very closely with them, and there are a lot of different ways to do that.
So Tamara, when we think about that through the lens of policy and regulation, are there some examples of places around the world that do it very well? If we were to think about having sort of an industry-wide standard or a benchmark?
Do ESG well or permitting well?
ESG, permitting, community stakeholder engagement.
I would say that the United States is not the best place for permitting, just in terms of the 10 to 15 to 18 years you're looking at for the permitting process versus where Rob's at in Australia, a little more streamlined there. ESG, the community involvement component of it and the non-governmental organization component of it, very much driven by local and regional laws and regulations at this point. We're seeing more of that, where where mines are being required to reach out more to the communities in which they work and to make impacts on those communities, positive impacts. But I would say, the countries such as Canada and Australia are at the forefront of that, while other countries such as in Africa, maybe not so much.
But then, a great example I had was working in West Africa in a mine there, and we actually had to relocate a village. Unfortunately, the mine was there, and going through that process of relocating the village, working with the other community, having them involved in the process of where they were going to move, how they were going to move, and working through that. It was really rewarding on that side of things as well. And so I think whilst some of the policy side of things in Africa is a bit challenging, I think there are definitely some great ESG or social aspects that have been driven through that as well.
So one of the things that a lot of young people think about is the responsibility mining companies have to be environmental stewards. And if we use the example of the United States, the length for permitting relative to Canada and Australia, one of the observations is that mining in Canada and Australia is just as safe and does just as good a job of being an environmental steward as mining operations in the United States. And yet there's this significant difference in the length of time it takes to get permitted. Any thoughts on that, Tamara? If you could be an ear to the policymakers in Washington, D.C., sharing your understanding of permitting through the lens of Australia and Canada, places that do it extremely well, what might you offer as counsel?
I actually spent the first 10 years of my career doing that. So I have a little bit of an idea about advising folks in Washington, D.C. on these types of issues, especially in the environmental and energy technology arena. But I think the United States is more politicized than other countries. I think we have a lot more, well, the whole idea behind wokeness around ESG now with the counter investor push. So you've got investors on one hand pushing for ESG regulations, and now you've got a whole group of woke investors saying ESG takes this too far, and they're pushing regulators to now come down and prohibit companies from enforcing or enacting ESG initiatives. So I think in the United States, we are much more free-forming in our thought and our actions, and that shows up in Washington, D.C. for sure, and shows up in the regs and the politics of setting regulations in this area.
So Adrian, we heard earlier from Ernst & Young, and ESG ranked as the top of the top 10 concerns that the mining industry has globally. And in my earlier presentation, and we're all well aware of this, we need to mine at an unprecedented scale and rate over the next couple of decades in order to achieve the climate goals of the Paris Accord and other countries and jurisdictions around the world. What makes you optimistic that we can rise to the challenge?
It is a big challenge, right? We talk about this a lot within our own company, our meetings, and saying that we as a company and as an industry are being asked to produce more metals, more critical materials for the energy transition, and we're being asked to do that with less impact, right? So how do we produce more with less impact? I think I'm optimistic because it's become everyday conversation. Everybody is driving towards the same goal. Everybody wants to collaborate, and we are working as an industry together. I think maybe 5 years ago even, you would go into a room and you might feel rather alone talking about these challenges. But you come here and in almost every single conversation, a keynote, we're talking about collaboration, community, and decarbonization. So I think that as an industry, we're acting as a collaborated, united front, and that gives me a lot of optimism.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank the three of you, Adrian, Tamara, and Rob, for joining us for the last panel of today. Thank you.